Hi, I'm Rob, and thanks for discovering season 1 of Two Bye Guys. We hope you enjoy it. So, in season 1, we recorded everything in person. It was pre pandemic, and we used professional sound booths. And as you'll hear, the audio quality is pretty great, but it was also very complicated and expensive. And when the pandemic hit, those booths became impossible. So, in season 2, we tried recording interviews locally while chatting on Zoom, which kind of worked, but the audio quality was spotty. Sometimes people made manual mistakes with the recording. It was a huge hassle for me to receive the files, convert the formats, compile the audio, edit by hand. I knew I needed a better solution if I was going to continue the podcast. And Zencaster was that solution. The thing that was most important to me, knowing how the process works, is that the audio gets recorded locally, not over the internet like Zoom does. When you get up to seasons 3 and 4, you'll hear how good the audio quality is. It rivals what you're about to hear from season 1, which was recorded in professional sound booths. And it's so much easier and cheaper. Everyone can record from home with whatever equipment they have, even just a laptop's built-in mic. And then there's the editing and post-production. I used to have to go through every track manually, reducing background noise, mixing volumes and levels, making sure my guest and I were synced. Now, Zencaster post-production takes care of all of that and delivers ready to upload files. So if you're thinking about starting your own podcast, I highly recommend Zencaster. It's easy, it's affordable, and it's very reliable, and the sound quality is great. And now if you go to Zencaster.com/pricing and enter promo code 2BYGUYS, you'll get 30% off your first 3 months. That's Zencastr.com/pricing, promo code 2BYGUYS for 30% off your first 3 months. It's time to share your story with Zencaster.
Welcome to Two Bye Guys. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rob.
And we are switching things up a little bit. The first 2 episodes, we got to chat quite a bit about our stories, and we are really excited to share with you an interview that we had with a different Bye Guy.
Yeah, we interviewed Jay Christopher, a activist, an educator, an artist who identifies as fluid. He founded Fluid by Design, which is a support advocacy community for sexually fluid people of color. And in 2014, they began offering Menkind, the first ever monthly support group specifically for bi-identified sexually fluid men of African descent. It's kind of like that Bi Request group that you and I met at. And I think Jay Christopher went to that group first too, and then decided he wanted to start another conversation that wasn't happening, and you'll hear him talk about that.
Both New York-based groups, very similar in purpose, but this was very focused in its audience, I think.
Yeah, and also Jay Christopher is perhaps best known as the first bisexual Grand Marshal of Pride. What is the Grand Marshal of Pride, Alex?
Yeah, a Grand Marshal is essentially who Pride is honoring that year. Pride picks out figures or corporations or organizations to honor each year. Mm-hmm. And he was the first ever bi person to be honored in that way.
Cool.
So they march right at the front of the parade, essentially.
Wasn't Trevor Project, where you work, a Grand Marshal this year at World Pride?
The Trevor Project was actually Grand Marshal this year.
Very cool. So anyway, as you listen to this, I think what is really interesting about it for me was how many similarities there are in our stories and Jay Christopher's. I just think a lot of fluid and bisexual people go through lots of similar things. But then also it's very interesting to see where our experiences are different. Like, for example, as I've said, I feel as I've explored relationships with people of different genders that it has actually felt very similar to me, that I've kind of been shocked by how similar it feels. Whereas Jay Christopher talks about having very different types of relationships with men versus women. And that's totally valid too. And actually, I've met so many people in Bi Request and in other places who have that experience. And you'll get to hear some of what that's like now.
Yeah, but we won't delay any further. Why don't we'll pass you along to the interview.
Yeah, enjoy.
We have a guest today, actually. We have Jay Christopher here with us.
What's going on? Good to be here.
Very good to have you. Jay Christopher is a native son of Detroit, Michigan. Chris is a mixed media visual artist who studied fine art African American Studies and Women's Studies at Eastern Michigan University, and then enrolled in Howard University's Master of Fine Arts program. He began his work in alternative spaces and with marginalized identities within communities of color. Chris's work as an artist, educator, and community organizer is focused on re-envisioning the psycho-emotional spaces that Black men and other men of color have traditionally occupied, with an eye for reimagining the creative and compassionate possibilities within masculinity. Very interesting stuff, Chris. We have a lot to talk about from that alone, don't we?
Yeah, that's a run on there.
So perhaps a good place to start is actually, since you mentioned it, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you identify.
Yeah, so I identify myself as being, well, really at this particular point in my life, I identify myself as being sexual, just being a human being who's sexual. I think my overall feeling is that that's what defines most of all human beings, and that there's these various categories that are based on socializations and culture and religion and the various things that bracket who we are. But for the purposes of the world that I live in now, I identify as a sexually fluid man of African descent, as opposed to a bisexual, because I'm not interested in uplifting the binary. So I'm interested in uplifting the spectrum. So sexually fluid means I get to move around in that as well.
Yeah. Cool. So tell us a little bit about kind of how your experience as a sexually fluid man of African descent has influenced the work that you've done. You know, your art and your educating of other people.
Yeah, I think probably the best place to begin is with the art, because I think before I started to educate other people or just hold space with other people, I was, just having a conversation in my work about my experiences and explorations. And so I think and feel that whenever you realize that you don't fit, so to speak, into whatever the category is or the box is, then whatever the things are that identify that become in question. So like I started thinking about, well, what is masculinity then? Because I feel pretty much like a dude, feel pretty masculine, but I also like men. So what does that mean? I think that I started to have a conversation in my artwork that was an exploration of manhood and then masculinity, which is very different, and then myth, because I was also interested in how we tell our stories and just the whole notion of myth making, how myths are made. Because you can have personal myths. Like, I mean, all of us are one part the truth, one part legend, one part myth. Depends on who we're talking to, right? So, how do we create myths that are that support and promote and make us feel good about who we are, as opposed to concern ourselves with myths that don't have anything to do with who you are, like they don't speak to you at all. So how do you recreate all of that? I was in graduate school and I was working with a lot of artists, working around a lot of artists who were female identified. And they were doing all this work about womanhood, and it was always this dealing with this sort of the sacred feminine, like the idea that the ovaries and the uterus and the creative center of a woman is sacred. And I realized how when men talk about their dicks, they talk about it in like the third person, like I'm going to knock some boots, I'm going to bang out, I'm going to lace a pipe. Like it's like this whole, like it's a thing, it's a machine, it's a tool, but not something sacred. And so I started thinking about, well, what is the sacred masculine? What does that mean? So part of that work and taking these sexualized, objectified images of men that were either in sports magazines or in porn magazines, and then flipping that narrative to something that is sacred or spiritual, allowed me to do a couple of things. One thing is play with the sacred and profane, which all artists do on one level, and then just really to interrogate some of these ideas in an effort to be self-determined and self-actualized.
Yeah.
So the way that Mankind came about, Fluid by Design came about, is I was listening to the radio one morning on my way to work. I used to development work for a nonprofit. And there was a young white woman who was on NPR, on Brian Lehrer, and she was talking about bisexuality. And she was talking about how, there was this newfound acceptance for bisexual people, and, bisexual people are embracing bisexuality, and all this like very glorious conversation. I was thinking, not in the Black community. Mm-hmm. Not in the Black community, because in the Black community, bisexual men are held as responsible for the rising HIV rates among straight women because of the DL, the down low and stuff like that, that there are so many bisexual men who are not open. And so bisexuals are looked at as being very suspicious. And then on the other side, suspicious to the gay community, because like, well, what do you want to be? So you're saying you like women? Like it's this whole like threatening thing about bisexuality. And I think that at Howard, the fact that I was humbly and respectfully kind of popular with the women but also openly bisexual was super threatening to my professors who were also trying to be with the students as well. I hate to say it like that, but I know that to be true. That was true. So I think it was kind of like, well, who is this guy? Like, he's openly bisexual and a black male was like really, I think, something that a lot of people weren't used to. In fact, my girlfriend at the time, she didn't mind knowing herself. She didn't want me to tell anyone, though. She didn't want anybody her friends to know that she was dating an openly bisexual dude. Like, it was all of that kind of shit. So,
how long have you been open about your fluid sexuality, and like when did you come to that understanding for yourself, and how?
Since I told my mama, that was the most important thing to me.
How old were you?
I was in college. I didn't have my first experience wasn't until like 25 or 26 years old.
Okay.
Yeah.
The first time I, bought a Hustler magazine. So Hustler's porn from a long time ago for those who are young.
Like an actual magazine.
Yeah,
like you
an
had
actual
to
magazine, not
print
not
on a
zine,
page.
A magazine. I kind of graduated from like Playboy and all the like Penthouse and these kind of porn magazines to Hustler, and I realized that when I looked at Hustler, one of the things I liked about it is that they always had these like soft porn photo shoots where there would be a man and a woman there, and I found I'm excited about seeing them two together, and then I realized I'm excited about seeing him naked as well.
Yeah.
So I think at an early age the interest was there, like the desire was there, and and the funny thing about retrospect and hindsight is, as a grown man, an older man, I can think now that I remember like my good friend in high school. I remember being aware of that he was attractive.
Yeah.
I didn't know what those feelings were, but I was aware of his attractiveness.
Right.
So I think as you get hindsight, you get older, you start to think, well, maybe I knew, well, maybe I knew, well, maybe I knew.
Yeah.
So the question of when did you know is, I think, a challenging question. When did I first feel something? When I was very young. When did I first know? In college, when I had the first experience that I had. I grew up around gay people. My mother and father had friends who were gay. That someone would live in a different kind of lifestyle was not new to me or new to my family. So when I had my first experience, I told my mother because I had met men who were gay, and I knew many of them couldn't go home. They didn't have any relationships with their families, like their families had ostracized them. And so I decided, when I had my first experience, which I knew was going to lead to more experiences because I'm the type dude that if I taste something and I like it, it's on the menu. Like, as long as it doesn't like interfere with anybody else's rights or anything like that. Like, it's like, if it's good for you, it's good for me. We can do this. So I knew I was going to have more experiences. But if something happened to me, because this is late '80s, early '90s, HIV is really on the rise and rapid. So if something happened to me, I wanted to know that I could go home. I didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah. But my joke used to be that if the gay club burns down, I don't want my mama to be like, oh, my son wouldn't be in the gay club. I want to just come get my body because I was in the gay club, I wanted to know.
Wow.
So once I told my mother, which was over dinner one day, I told her I wanted to share something with you. And she was like, okay, what do you want to tell me? I was like, well, I've been exploring my sexuality. And she was like, okay, well, what does that mean? And the waitress came to get our drink order. And I said, well, I've been sleeping with men. And then she looked at me and she said, can you make that a double? To the waitress. And then we laughed, and then she went on to to give me a few tips. Like, she was like, my friend such and such, they found him, dead in his apartment, no sign of forced entry, robbed, like, don't pick up anybody you don't know, be careful.
Yeah.
Once I knew my mom was good, I didn't really give a fuck about anybody else. Like, my father never used any other word but faggot.
Oh, wow.
So I did not tell him. Because we already had like a father-son kind of relationship, I mean, cool, but like, I didn't tell him, and he died shortly after that period anyway. But once I knew my mom was good, I really, really clearly really didn't give a fuck what anybody else thought. It's like, whatever.
That's great. Yeah. Was she supportive of the fluid identity, or had you figured that out when you told her?
No, I mean, I just said I had been sleeping with men. I mean, I don't think, at least in my experience, you can have experiences for a while before you actually embrace something.
Right.
Yeah.
You can keep having them, like,
right.
okay.
Right.
I'm sure the first few times that some shit that went down, I was like, okay, that's not going to happen again.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was that.
Yeah.
Well,
so, and then it just keeps on happening, and then you realize, okay, this is me.
Yeah.
Well, that and what you were saying before matches so much up with what Alex and I have experienced, and we've talked about this, is like we had these attractions and then even started having experiences, but it takes a little while to add them up and realize what that means and come to that identity. And it is like, if you're not in the binary, it's a slow process of realizing it because it's a gray area and it's complicated.
This may have changed now. I mean, I'm a little bit of an older person now, but this may have changed. But, a woman traditionally can have like an alternative sexual experience while she's in college. And like, there's no dude that's going to be like, oh, I'm not going to fuck with her anymore because, she ate some pussy. So she's still fire and they're going to fuck with her. But, you suck a dick, you're gay.
Yeah.
For a lot of people.
That is definitely still the perception.
Yeah. So it's like, and figuring out how to negotiate this apples and oranges things where just because I've now discovered oranges, I still enjoy apples. You know what I'm saying?
What? How?
Occasionally with like a fruit salad, but but it's like, how do I negotiate that space? And I think for me, the strategy became just being straight up. My joke used to be that if you even act like you're going to give me some pussy, I'm going to tell you what's up.
Yeah.
Because that way, if it's a deal breaker, at this point, I'm not emotionally invested. You can't hurt my feelings by saying, oh, that I can't go for that. We can be like, okay, cool. If I get all emotionally invested because I'm an emotional person, and then you're like, I can't do this because then I'm going to feel hurt and rejected and dejected and all this other kind of shit that I wasn't investing in. So my strategy just became saying it, here's what you need to know.
Yeah.
Right. It's a good filter for who's going to accept you or not. And if they're not, why waste your effort on that?
Yeah. I think what I've been fortunate enough, for whatever reasons, is I've never been turned down by any woman for being bisexual.
Wow.
If they
really?
did, it was after they fucked me.
Really?
So like it wasn't before. So like I think, and I don't know what that's about other than the energy that you put out and what you draw to you, but I just don't draw the woman to me who's like, oh, I wouldn't fuck around with. I draw the woman who's, like I'm an artist, man. I'm in the arts community. I draw the Afro punk, queer community, queer chick.
Yeah.
Who may be straight, but, whatever else, so I just haven't had the experience of being rejected around it, which is why I started the men's group.
Yeah.
Because I knew that there were a lot of men who were really grappling with this whole thing of how to live this duality. Yeah. And I felt like for whatever blessings I had been able to do that and do that openly. And at that time I was in a polyamorous relationship, which was going on while I was in the Grand Marshal. So there's like pictures all over the internet of me and my poly family. It was like 4 of us. And so I was just really living this life that I look back and think of, what the fuck was I doing? But like, I was living this very open, experiential life. I felt the same way about living that life as I felt about being Grand Marshal, which was, for me, being Grand Marshal was about humbly giving permission. Like saying to any other dude out there, because I realize how I present. I present masculine. I'm a bigger guy. I present in a way that people don't think I'm anything but straight anyway, most of the time. So I understood the power of that. I understood what that meant as a Grand Marshal. I understood what that meant in interviews. I understood what that meant in facilitating a group. So my intention was to create space for brothers to really, talk this out, and to learn to love and have confidence in themselves enough to know that, like, there's tons of women out here who are still going to be down.
We're talking a lot about women, but have you faced much rejection from men or challenges with men?
No. I mean, yes, challenges.
Yeah.
And maybe some rejection, but I have to say that I don't think that any two bisexuals are built the same.
Yeah.
So there might be, by the term bisexual, which again is not the term I use, there might be some people that are right in the middle who love and have the same connection to men and women equally and can have the same experiences equally. I think my emotional orientation still is largely with women. I've only been in one relationship with a guy before, and it was a great relationship for me. I don't think it was a great relationship for him. It was a great relationship for me. And so I think that whereas I may have had challenges with guys, I have to admit that maybe it didn't mean as much to me emotionally. Like it didn't affect me. Like I was able to negotiate it. I mean, listen, my one and only boyfriend, Jesse. Shout out to Jesse.
Hi, Jesse.
We put up with a lot. There's a way that I might cuddle with my girlfriend on the couch that's not how I cuddle with the dude I'm with. Somehow, whenever I'm with dudes, it's like we're still dudes. This is, very heteronormative thinking, but like I don't think to be kissing you on your neck or cuddling with you in that way or holding hands. Like, I don't think I've ever reached to hold the hands of a man I was with, ever. Like, I don't think I've ever done that. And I don't know if that's some line that I have that I haven't, that's fuzzy, or some politics that I have that I haven't worked out. I don't know about all of that. I just know that what my boyfriend wanted, because we were also in this poly thing, was for me to treat him in the same way that I treated my girlfriends. And I guess I hadn't been socialized to do that or didn't know how to do that, but I just didn't do that. Which was oddly enough, though, whenever I saw him out in public, I would always go to kiss him in public. He wouldn't kiss me in public. So it's because of his stuff, because he came out with me.
Yeah.
Like, he wasn't out before he got involved with me. It helped me to sort of work out where men sit for me and where women sit for me within my fluidity.
Yeah. And I think you outlined well a point that I tell a lot of folks who are kind of like exploring their sexuality, that it's not about trying to change anything or try to sway anything. It's just about kind of opening yourself up to all potential relationships and seeing what feels comfortable.
Yeah. And acceptance.
Yeah.
Because within the acceptance is healing. So in the healing part, and that's, you tell yourself a whole bunch of fucked up stories about when you don't feel like you're supposed to be who you're supposed to be.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Or doing what you're supposed to do. So, and I think acceptance has a lot to do with, first comes acceptance, then comes healing.
Exactly.
Like I'm good.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So can you tell us a little more about Fluid by Design and Menkind? Like, what actually are those organizations? How do they function? Who goes to those groups? All that stuff.
So the group is on hiatus now. Menkind's the monthly men's group is on hiatus now.
Okay.
But this was the first group that was actually for bi-identified men of African descent, and African descent was intentional.
Yeah.
It was not people of color. It was African descent.
Yeah.
Because I really wanted to have a conversation with black men. The first meeting, it's had a few people at it, and most of them were people who had worked at GMAD who were like curious about this meeting. And I just kept having more. And I think I had sort of a field of dreams attitude about it. Like, if I build it, they'll come.
Yeah.
So I built it. And then because there just needed to be a space.
Yeah.
And I think as around the city, the word of mouth, brothers started hearing about this, like, black bisexual meeting that goes on in Brooklyn. And, through that first 3 or 4 years, we explored a lot of topics. From meditation and spirituality to we had dialogues with the trans community, because there was a lot of folks in the group didn't know anything. And what's interesting is that it was a bi-identified group, a sexually fluid group, but a good deal of the brothers that were there would have probably identified as gay. Because what I found really interesting is that I felt like there were a lot of brothers who didn't necessarily know if they were gay. They just know that they had to make a choice at some particular point, so they made a choice.
Right.
Like, they didn't see how they could negotiate the duality. And so it was easier to deal with men than it was to find women and still feel like they were integrity and not lying and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I felt like there were a lot of guys at the group who were exploring that aspect. I think for a lot of brothers, it was just cool to have a space where you could talk about sucking a dick and not feel like somebody was going to look at you crazy, you know what I'm saying, as part of a conversation. We didn't have dick sucking forums or conversations just about that. But, being able to just freely express yourself as a bisexual man and not have other folks. So that's what Menkind was about.
Maybe you can talk a little bit more about being a Grand Marshal for Pride. That kind of elevated your platform. What led to that?
So the visibility was kind of getting around the city, and the word was getting around the city. And then when the Grand Marshal thing came up, someone recommended me. That's how I got there in the first place. And in all actuality, I think one of the reasons why they chose me is because the bisexual community had been, going to bat with Heritage of Pride, who runs the Pride events, for a long time about bi visibility, for a long time. Right. And every year had been like, we need to have a bi Grand Marshal. We've never had a bi Grand Marshal. We've never had a bi Grand Marshal. And so finally, when it came time to decide who it was, the new guy who didn't have any baggage attached to him politically, you know what I'm saying? There was no baggage attached to me. I was just a new guy, fresh on the scene. I had I think a story that they found interesting, being working in youth development and working with young people and building this new organization and whatnot. That's why they approached me about it. I sat with it for a minute because I wasn't sure if I really was never interested, and still not interested in being on the cover of the book. And so I was really curious about that level of outness and openness. Right. And I had been teaching for years. I've been teaching all over the city through all kinds of arts programs and for the DOE and stuff. So I knew that making this very public decision was going to have a lot of people be like, what? Like, what? I didn't know. What? You know, and I'm sure that there were faces in that crowd along Fifth Avenue who were like, that's Mr. Neal from Global Studies, you know, from Global, you know. And then also people who had dated me and been with me and known me and who maybe might feel some kind of way about whatever. So I sat with that for about 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
That's not too long.
And I'm being joking about it, but like, I mean, I didn't sit long with it, you know, because I also felt that I had an opportunity to have the mic.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that meant that I could raise consciousness around sexual fluidity and around spectrums and around this as a part of the Black community's sexuality and experience as well, and people of color and all of that. So I had an opportunity to do that, and so I jumped on that.
It's kind of crazy how Pride was founded by a bisexual person, right? Brenda Howard.
Yes.
And yet there hadn't been a bi grand marshal. Like, did you feel any pressure to meet certain expectations as the first one?
Yeah, I didn't feel any pressure. I felt a responsibility. I had a lot of great mentors who told me all of this and got me up to speed on all of this information. So once I had the mic, it was kind of like I was very clear. I felt more of a responsibility to talk about the disparities in the LGBT community, like around almost all the health and well-being disparities. Bi-identified people are at the lowest end of that in terms of alcoholism, drug addiction, homelessness, like all of those disparities within the LGBTQ community. It's bi-identified people, and then after that, trans folks. So I got a chance to really raise those disparities. I went to the White House with met Obama, and when the bi community was working with Obama to make sure that there was bi visibility in his agenda. And so just having an opportunity I had a PowerPoint with all this, to raise some of those statistical variables and talk about the amount of money that goes to gay and lesbian agenda within the LGBT community versus everybody else's agenda.
Barely any for bi
it's really an agenda controlled by well-off white gays and lesbians. Like, control the agenda of the LGBTQ community on some level, particularly around funding. So it was a chance to have an open discussion around those disparities, which are racialized, you know, and so then that's where you have the intersection of race in this conversation.
And even now, the thing, unfortunately, is Black trans women being shot, for example, in this country, right? They're even further below bi people in that respect, and part of that is their race, you know, creates that target on them.
Yeah, well, and also bisexual people are less likely to be out, and that causes a lot of internal damage and mental health issues, and I think that's racialized also. I think there's an intersection, because you were talking about the DL. Like, I think it's probably even harder for non-white people to come out as bi or trans.
Yeah, and that's why the group was so important, because community, like, I mean, part of those disparities, as you say, have to do with not having a place or community or fellowship.
Right.
Or, like, there's no bi club.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, there's no bi clubs. Like, you know, we just kind of weave in and out of the environments we want to be in, depending where we are, but there's no space. And so, you know, creating an actual space. Speaking of space, like, we could have gotten free space at the LGBTQ Center in Brooklyn, but we didn't meet in any LGBTQ spaces because many men who are grappling with this are not going to go to a space that has LGBTQ on the door.
Right.
Yeah.
So we met in museums, and we met in, like, you know, we met in spaces that were just spaces.
I totally identify with that, because the first time I tried to go to Bi Request, I walked up to the center and just kept walking. I couldn't go in the door of the LGBT center. And then a month later, I worked up the courage to go to the next meeting. But that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it's especially important kind of seeing Menkind and what the work Menkind has done, you know, Bi Request and in other spaces. Almost in any community, there becomes kind of the white space. We have a tendency as white people to consume a space, right? Due to our privilege and just the ability to overlook any need for another conversation, right? And I think it's unfortunate that, you know, the bi communities, with so many people being closeted, with so many people being erased in general, right? Because we're not identifying bi people on the street in the same way, that it becomes so much more work to identify those spaces, and those spaces are also so much more required, right?
Yeah, intersectionality is a bitch.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you know, so to be bi and black and, you know, like, you know, and and whatever else is in your identity, I think all of those things, which is why the conversation in Mankind was not, I always say it was a space that privileged the voices of bi-identified and sexually fluid people, but the conversation was not just about that. Because I knew there were a lot of things that folks needed to talk about and share about and be with others about that had to do with just surviving as men of color in America and what that means.
I'm curious what your perception is of the connection between fluidity of sexuality and fluidity of gender. And especially like within those spaces you created and within the Black community, do you see innate understandings and collaborations, or where do you see clashes?
I see collaboration and understanding facilitated, but not necessarily innate. In fact, I used to just say fluid. And then when someone said to me, well, do you mean sexually fluid or gender fluid? And I was like, oh, gender fluid. Didn't think about that.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So there was a blind spot even for me, and like, okay, yeah, people can be gender fluid, you know, like, so I didn't think about that. So a lot of the conversations that came out of Mankind, dude, had to do with conversations that I fucking wanted to have myself.
Yeah.
I want to know more about this. Maybe other people want to know more about this. I think that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to it, except that as someone who is part of a, air quotes, marginalized community, you know, there's not a lot of room at the margins to be at each other's throat about shit.
Yeah.
So if we can get into some conversation, or at least agree to disagree, or at least agree to, you know, like, I don't really understand, put it like this, I can't put my head around what it means to be a trans person. Because I'm cis.
Right.
So for me, it's like, oh boy, I feel like a boy. I can't possibly know what that feels like, but I don't have to know.
Yeah.
Right.
I just need to acknowledge that it is what it is, and I honor and respect it.
Right.
That's it. And so that was the spirit of the conversation, is that we don't have to agree.
Right.
Yeah.
We can agree to disagree, but let's be in community around it.
I think something my bisexual identity has helped me learn is that when somebody else tells you something about their identity, believe them. Because especially when it comes to your gender identity, in addition to sexual orientation, it's not easy to come out and say that you're not the gender you were born under, or that you're exploring that. And so you don't have to exactly understand what that is like, but you can believe that person and believe in their experience that they're telling you.
And hold conversation more than anything. And
Right, and
welcome
learn about
conversation and listen. Right.
Yeah, part of my work is implicit bias work, and that's all about that. Like, you don't have to really understand. You just have to, you know, like, you don't have to get it.
Right.
But it is.
Right.
And my personal belief, you know, I think I started off this interview by saying that I really identify as sexual, because in my belief, it's like we can keep adding letters to the end of LGBTQ as people discover various ways in which they express themselves, and eventually we'll get to human beings are sexual.
Yeah.
That was always my goal, that one day you'll open a human development book in junior high and it'll say human beings are sexual. Here we're going to explore a few ways.
Yeah.
It really has to do with how the Western paradigm is constructed, this idea that everything has to have a category and a way of measuring it and a way of understanding it. That's a Western paradigm. And this is, you know, when you look into indigenous cultures where they have two-spirited, you know, and different kinds of ideas around gender identity and whatnot, like, there's this sense that there's a fluidity in a lot of indigenous cultures anyway. Yeah. This is about the West, and the West's need to name something.
Is there anything that you would want white people, especially heteronormative white people, but also maybe queer white people, to understand about the non-white queer experience that isn't talked about, or that is like treated in a harmful way?
So you know that I'm an I'm an anti-racist educator.
Right.
So this is what I do.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, hell yeah, there's a whole bunch of shit you can say. But, you know, I think a lot of times whenever white folks ask me questions similar to that, I say that what I would want white folks to spend time doing is understanding who they are in all of this.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of the paternalism of whiteness is around, like, you know, racism and things like that being something that white people are going to help get rid of for the benefit of black people. But racism collapses everybody's identity, steals everybody's imagination. As you probably know, you know, Jews weren't always white. Italians weren't always white. Irish weren't always white. They were invited into whiteness as a part of the making of this country, white supremacy within the American context. Right.
Yeah.
And so with doing that, then you leave your Italianness behind and you leave your Irishness behind. So, like, whiteness has robbed white folks of a lot. You know, so there's a lot to think about in terms of how the intersection of white supremacy and queer identity is for you. And then how you act upon, how you show up in the world as a result of that would be the thing that I would offer. You know, I think the thing that's really interesting is, and I may have said this to you already, is that, you know, my sexual orientation is not my lead identity marker anymore. You know, there was a period of time for a couple years, particularly when I was doing all of this work in the LGBT community, when I was like Chris, the bi guy.
Yeah.
But first and foremost, a black man. And that the specter of racism and the way that it impacts every aspect of existence for people of color. When I was looking at the disparities, there was still within that LGBTQ tent a lot of disparities around race. I mean, I think my biggest disappointment, and not that I had any kind of pie in the sky ideal about it, was how racist I found Heritage of Pride to be.
Yeah.
Like as an organization. And a lot of the other LGBTQ community organizations, when I went to things, the conversation was framed from a privileged white perspective almost always. And everyone else in the audience was trying to get another identity, a kind of conversation in there. I thought that part of the reason why the space that I created was so valuable was because there were a lot of folks who went to these other spaces and just felt like it's a white space that I'm included in, like my work and everything else in America. You know what I'm saying? Not a space for me.
Like people talk, in feminist discussion, people talk a lot about white feminism, for example, right? And I feel like that's for the last couple of decades even. That's been a term that has been coined, used appropriately and understood. I think that's the next stage potentially in the queer
without
discussion,
a doubt.
Right? Because that's a huge piece that's missing, especially, here in New York, the most diverse city in the country. And I still have the feeling that like that gay white man is going to take any queer space and make it his own.
Yeah,
right.
I agree. That, and that is the most difficult part of all of the discussions that I have in anti-racism spaces is the conversation around whiteness. Like that's where all my pushback comes from. That's where all the like uncomfortable feelings and the fragility and the tears come from, because it's very rarely are white folks really asked to even think about what that is.
Right.
Or what that is or what that means or how it shows up or any of those kinds of things.
I do think you're so right, and that is so important for white people to think about and talk about. I framed the question sort of from that biased point of view, but I agree with what you're saying so much, because a lot of those white privilege and white supremacy and also heterosexual privilege was totally invisible to me until I started having sort of a crisis of my own identity, and that forced me to think critically and interrogate myself and my identity. And it came out first in terms of my sexuality. But then once I started looking at that and breaking down the structures that were in place and the things that I had been taught, that then gave me a new understanding of white supremacy and of my white privilege. And it all felt connected. And I think unless you have that kind of crisis like I had, it's relatively easy to go through life and not think about any of this stuff and for your privilege to be totally invisible to you.
I agree. I mean, identifying as a sexually fluid person and being involved in all the stuff I was involved in didn't stop me from being a patriarchal asshole from time to time.
Yeah.
Right.
I was still very heavy heteronormative practices, very like my masculinity was structured and constructed in a way that would be considered today toxic. You know what I'm saying? Like I was still doing all of that stuff.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So
yeah, me too. I still probably do.
Yeah, even I think the work that I've done, like the work that I've been doing particularly in the Center for Racial Justice and Education, which I put a plug in for, is that there's a lot of very diverse identities in that organization, and working with we always work in cross-racial teams, and I have. A lot of my white co-trainers have said to me, I'm really happy to work with you because you teach me so much then show me so many things I didn't realize. But I'm really happy to work with some of the female-identified trainers I work with, because they catch me on shit that is man shit that I have complete blinders on because I just never think about it. Even down to, pronouns. Like I used to say this joke when I in my trainings, when I introduced myself, I said my pronouns are he, him, and bruh. And everybody would always laugh. And then one day, I was out in Seattle, and a person who was trans-identified said, introduced themselves and said, I appreciate it if we don't make jokes about pronouns.
Yeah.
Well, pronouns didn't mean shit to me because I'm cisgendered and, in the norm, and a pronoun didn't mean that much to me.
Yeah.
And my point is that, all of this work in identity and justice is illuminating. I was saying to my friend the other day, my colleague the other day, it's like it's the gift that keeps on giving in a lot of ways, because I never walk away from any experience having not had an aha moment out something, like either in my own transformation and growth or in my understanding of the work that I do. So
I also think it's harmful to be a cog in an unfair machine, even if you're in a place of privilege within that machine, and especially when you don't see how that machine works. So like when we recognize where we are in that machine, that's the first way to start to combat it.
Yeah, and that's what creates the fragility in the room.
Yeah.
A lot of times, and
Right.
which is okay. I don't have a problem with white fragility. It's just that it's funny. The question that you asked me just a few minutes ago,
Right.
the first thing that came to mind in the back of my mind was that we, and I mean this collective we, which I probably don't have the right to speak for, are tired of educating white folks on what oppression is. Go read a book. Go find out for yourself. I'm not holding space for you to cry about your aha moment just now that you're a white woman. Like I've had people in training say, I just realized I was white like 3 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
I get it. And at the same time, in terms of emotional labor, and particularly women of color have held that space of like educating and holding the emotions for everyone on this shit.
Yeah.
Like your moment of like taking care of white folks in the room. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
As they have this moment of transformation where they realize. So I think on some level when you asked that question, I was thinking, I don't have anything to tell you. Go. There's a whole bunch of shit. You did Robin DiAngelo book. That's what I'm saying. Go read that. Affirmative action was white. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff out here. Like, to get clear on whiteness and white supremacy.
Yeah.
And it's not the role of the people of color in your life to like to teach you that.
Yeah.
And to educate you on that. They may choose to in your relationship, but it's not their role.
Yes, well, thank you for educating us on that at my request. But yes, I agree with that. We appreciate that, and thank you for giving us a little bit of that education and also just having a conversation about you and who you are and everything.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been good. It's been fun.
So that was our interview with Jay Christopher. Listening to it again, I feel a little awkward about the way that I asked that final question about race and intersectionality, but I also think it led to a really good and important conversation. And I actually think it reminds me of my bisexual experience and like sometimes the way that my parents or some friends have asked me, what do you want me to do differently? Or what do you want me to say differently to you now that I know that you're bi. And like often my answer is really just, I want you to learn more about queerness and what this stuff means. I want us all to have a better understanding of these issues. And so like his answer really made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I think I've experienced a lot when I talk with folks of color or with women or with trans folks, like a lot of the kind of like read the book response, right? Like just like go read a book, right? And I think that's super important to like validate that like that's the way I respond all the time to like, you want to know what it's like queer? Listen to the podcast in this case, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to like have to educate the person right in front of me in that moment and like have that put on me, right?
Yeah, right. And it's also how I learned about a lot of this is by doing my own research and learning about it. Yeah. And actually, another thing that Chris said that I've been thinking about, he talked about these intersecting identities and he talked about Italian and Jewish identity and how you sort of set those aside to become a white in this country. And I've been thinking about that a lot because I am Jewish. And when I started coming out as bi or realizing it, it suddenly felt very connected to my Jewish identity in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I think this sort of is the way, which is that like, as a Jew in America, I can pass for white, right? Like, I am a white person. And when I'm in a space where it may not be totally safe to identify as Jewish, I have learned from a very young age not to identify as Jewish and to pass as not Jewish to stay safer. And I think that I learned that at such a young age that when I then did that with my sexual identity and my bisexuality and learned to pass as straight, it felt so similar.
Maybe that's why you could kind of pass as straight for so long.
Right. I felt comfortable doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I would have had that energy to like pass for that long and to like hide that label.
Right.
But maybe your label as Jewish has your identity has just kind of trained you a little bit better. I think there's commonality amongst all those identities that are perhaps you can pass as something else, pass as the more privileged form of it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think there are plenty of other examples of that, I think, of right off the bat, like, disability and disabilities that folks might have, or various kind of gender identities, maybe, like passing as, male, as white.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. I don't know if I've ever noticed that one before.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris, for sparking that discussion, and I hope you all enjoyed that interview. We will be back next week with another great interview. Dr. Jane Ward, who wrote an awesome book about fluid sexuality, mostly among straight identified men. So come back for that next week. It's really awesome.
Yeah, super excited for that one. And thank you all for listening to Two Bad Guys.
Our music is by Ross Mincer and graphic design by Kaitlin Weinman. This podcast is edited by Moxie Peng and is also produced by Moxie Peng, Matt Loomis, Alex Boyd, and me, Rob Cohen. Thanks for listening to Two Bye Guys.